Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the many policies and regulations that affect American agriculture. Each week, we pull back the curtain on the programs, policies, and perceptions shaping the agricultural community in rural America. If you've ever felt like something doesn't add up, you're not alone. I'm Jenny, and this is Smoke and Mirrors. Let's make sense of the maze we call foreign policy. Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ift. I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University, and I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Maria Kalaitzandonakes today. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. I'm super excited to join you. So like you said, I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I mostly work on domestic food policy and food marketing, and I also lead the Gardner Food and Ag Policy survey team, which is a joint research venture between folks at Purdue and folks here at Illinois, trying to understand public perceptions on issues that are relevant to food and ag.
Terrific. So part of what I'm focusing on the podcast now is trying to better understand public health and nutrition issues, because I think those could potentially increasingly inform agricultural policy. So I'm very interested in your work in public perception. Could you first just talk about why we care about public perception and how it can influence policy?
Yeah, I love that we're starting sort of broad here. So as you've talked about on your podcast before, and as your listeners will remember, a lot of food and ag policy does happen pretty far removed from the public. So things like farm bills, congressional debates, right? USDA, FDA, EPA rulemaking, these are things that are pretty far from sort of public view and public input. But ultimately, as both taxpayers and consumers, the public is playing an important role in shaping food and farm outcomes and ultimately policy. And then this year, it's been really interesting to see food policy become so central to voters' perception. So during the presidential election, right, persistent food inflation meant that food prices and the policies related to that were central to a lot of voters' decisions. And then the Make America Healthy Again, MAHA campaign brought food policy, central to a lot of people's discussions too. That was things like subsidies, specifics of nutrition policy. We've been joking that MAHA has made food policy like common dinner conversation, which is wild if you're thinking about that compared to just a few years back. So public perceptions, I think, matter a lot broadly, as I said, as taxpayers and consumers, but also more recently, politicians are paying more close attention to public perceptions of food and policy issues.
Right. So it's way more than vibes. It drives elections and it drives the policies that actually get implemented. Could you talk a little bit more about the Gardner program and the work you do as a part of that?
Yeah. So in academic institutions and land-grant institutions, we try to engage with stakeholders and try to have our work be informed by stakeholders. So we've been conducting this quarterly survey called the Gardner Food and Ag Policy Survey that is with about 1,000 U.S. adult consumers each quarter. And we ask some continuous questions so that we can look at things over time. So things like trust in the food system, trust in actors, perceptions of food safety. But then also each wave we add questions that are relevant to sort of the chaos of food and ag policy that's going on right then. So we've gotten to do a lot sort of each wave that's relevant to folks.
Yeah, that's absolutely terrific. So I'd like to start with a discussion of your recent work on MAHA, but I think we can go through a lot of the different work you've done. Yeah, you recently posted on public perception of MAHA. You want to go through your basic findings with that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll back up a teeny bit so that if we have any listeners that aren't aware of what MAHA is, I'll just give the short snappy version of that. So Make America Healthy Again, MAHA, sort of came about at the tail end of this presidential election campaign when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. suspends his own campaign and endorses Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump gets up on the stage in New York and says he's going to let Kennedy and his team go wild on food and medicine, and sort of promises that while he's not going to be wavering on a lot of his, sort of MAGA specific policies, he's going to supplement those with this new MAHA interest. Kennedy brings this really important voting bloc to Trump, and Trump gets elected, not only for that reason, but that is an important piece of this. And then he taps Kennedy to lead Health and Human Services, which oversees like the FDA, the CDC, and others. As an aside, at the time, I think agricultural stakeholders were concerned about Kennedy being placed at the USDA rather than HHS. But in his role at HHS, he still has the capacity to influence food policy and the food system. And so MAHA has been important in affecting public opinion. They've widely criticized things like sugar, some sources of oil. They've been broadly supportive of things like meat and dairy and fruits and vegetables. They also have some other more sort of idiosyncratic thoughts on vaccines and medications on other places. So they are focusing specifically on food, environment, medical outcomes, and a lot of it is central to like the health of children.
Right. No, that's perfect. Yeah, what questions were you asking about public perception of MAHA?
Yeah. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page about what MAHA is, we've been asking in the last few waves how many people know about MAHA. So we first asked, have you heard of MAHA? About 65% of the people who responded knew about MAHA 3 months ago, and about 68% knew this time around. And then of those who were aware of MAHA, we asked them, how positively do you feel about them? So we asked them what their perception of it was. So they were allowed to say very positive, somewhat negative, very negative. Overall, perceptions of MAHA have been quite positive, but in the last 3 months, we saw pretty significant drops in perceptions of MAHA. So this was specifically driven by Democrats. So about 33% of Democrat respondents thought that MAHA was very positive in May, whereas only 17% that said that it was very positive in August. So across the board, people became a little bit more negative, but Democrats in particular became much more negative.
No, so I mean, it sounds like MAHA had a lot of bipartisan appeal. I mean, has it been a year since we've been saying MAHA?
One of the cool things about MAHA is the incredible bipartisan support. And that's one of the reasons why it's been touted as being so powerful and people are paying so close attention, is that you're seeing state regulation, you're seeing federal movement on both the right and the left, that people are excited about food and food issues in particular. There's less agreement on the medicine side, but there's a lot of bipartisan support on the food and ag side.
Yeah. Okay. So it is, what you have found though is it's definitely becoming more partisan as it evolves in terms of public perception, at least.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought was really useful to unpack was in the last two waves, we've asked respondents whether MAHA reflects their values in terms of food, agriculture, and medicine. So they were asked that in 3 separate questions. And in food and agriculture, support has remained very high. People have strong alignment across all 3 parties. Well, we categorize independents and others as like a third group, but across all 3 groups, this agreement that MAHA reflects people's values in food and agriculture has remained very high. So, for example, Republicans said over 90% of them said that it reflected their values in food and agriculture across both waves. Over 65% of independents or others said the same. Democrats' support has dropped, and that's been particularly true of medicines. So while support for agreement that MAHA reflects their values in terms of medicines has dropped across all 3 groups, Democrats dropped most substantially. So 3 months ago, they said, we found that 60% of Democrats agreed that MAHA reflected their values on medicines, but in the most recent wave, only 39% agreed with that. So a pretty substantial reduction. And it does seem like MAHA and the issues around vaccines and the changes at the CDC and others locations appear to be sticking points for Democrats.
I mean, maybe this is true with any political movement. You can start with high-level objectives that bring people together, but once you get some power and have to implement stuff, the rubber kind of hits the road, so to speak.
I mean, there are still a lot of things that are broadly agreed upon. Concerns around food additives are broadly bipartisan. Hopes to increase controls around certain agricultural technologies or certain food ingredients, like those are pretty bipartisan. There's also a lot of bipartisan support for increasing the health of the foods that we buy or the foods that are utilized in nutrition programs. But yeah, there's less bipartisan support in especially some of their policies or their ideas around medicines.
I have not heard a single argument in favor of food dyes. Maybe it exists. Maybe you have. Yeah, I'd like to dig into some of those some of the sort of state policies it's driving.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions on public perception of MAHA that you
On
looked at?
MAHA. So probably the last one we should highlight is that in this most recent wave, we asked about the MAHA Commission, which is sort of the formalization of the MAHA movement, which was established by President Donald Trump via executive order. They released a report that highlighted their concerns with children's health. And they identified 4 potential drivers that presented opportunities for progress. And those 4 drivers were poor diet, aggregation of environmental chemicals, lack of physical activity / chronic stress, and over medicalization. And this week they released a strategy to address some of that. The initial report came out much more critical than of the food system of agriculture, of environmental policy than the actual strategy did. But in this most recent wave, we asked respondents to rank the importance of these in terms of which they wanted the MAHA Commission to address first and their priority. And so what we find is that 36% of people said that poor diet is number 1. Address poor diet first is the most important thing. 31% of people said aggregation of environmental chemicals. And then fewer, so about 20%, said lack of physical activity and chronic stress. And then the least said over medicalization, so 13% said that was priority number 1. So you can see that there's, again, going back to bipartisan agreement, there's a lot of weight being thrown behind concern about poor diet and concern about aggregation of environmental chemicals.
So poor diet, I feel like it's pretty obvious. Exercise, obvious, even over medication, but could you talk a little bit more about this aggregation of environmental chemicals?
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise. I've been focusing primarily on the food side. The MAHA Commission report comes out pretty critically on things like pesticides, PFAS, heavy metals, right? There's a lot of different things that they critique, but it is a big base of the MAHA movement. There are a lot of people that are pretty passionate about aggregation of environmental chemicals.
So one of the things we talked about, there is actually a lot happening at the state level with some of these policies.
Yeah. Okay. So while there hasn't been a ton of federal movement, there have been certain things at the federal level that we've seen sort of changes. So to briefly summarize on the food side, we've seen that they have committed to updating the dietary guidelines and the processes behind that. We've seen some changes around food additives and the approval processes around that. We've also seen a definition of ultra-processed food, which has also been sort of central. They're working on that. So we have seen some things come out, but one of the food policy journalists that I follow, I really liked it. She lovingly called states the hammer of the MAHA movement because states are able to sort of react more quickly. I think there's a misconception amongst the public that a state food regulation is only going to affect that state. So even if the food policy says this only impacts the food that's sold or produced within that state, food manufacturers are producing product to be sold nationally, and it's very hard to segregate a product only for one particular area without having some inappropriate product getting on shelves. So for example, I talked to a food manufacturer that said a few years back, they tried segregating for just one small state to comply with a state food law, and they found inappropriate product on their shelves within a week. And the reason was not the Walmarts, the Targets, the Krogers of the world. The reason was there were small grocery stores that were getting, product from, let's say, Sam's Club or something across state lines and then having inappropriate product on their shelves. And because food manufacturers are the ones that are held liable, this means that food manufacturers, if there's a state law, they're going to be compliant with it nationally, generally. So at the state level, we've seen a lot of movement around MAHA. We've seen changes to school meal programs. We've seen mandated ingredient bans. We've seen mandated food labels. The ones I think that are really interesting right now, so West Virginia, which is not a state that you would typically associate with, restrictive food policy. They were sort of one of the first to create a pretty sweeping food dye ban. Texas created recently a food labeling requirement that says, warning, this product includes an ingredient that has been banned in the UK, EU, Australia, or Canada. That's not the exact language. You'll have to go to Texas SB 25, but something like that. And if they had a list of 44 ingredients, the list was initially longer.
Oh my goodness.
In the final edit of the bill before it was passed. Things like high fructose corn syrup, which were originally on it, aspartame, which was originally on it, those were nixed. Louisiana also recently passed a sort of MAHA-aligned law that requires some food labeling. So it's a QR code on products. And then they also, in the same bill, required that seed oils, so-called quote-unquote seed oils, be labeled and identified at restaurants in the state. So there's a lot coming out from states. I think we're only at the beginning of that. It'll be really interesting to watch.
And do you think, so you talked about Texas, Louisiana, states that are more solidly Republican or Republican leaning. Do you think you'll start to see this in all states, or to be determined?
We've seen movement in liberal states as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of movement across states, especially around school meal programs.
Okay.
But no, yeah, we've seen bills and laws making progress in both liberal and conservative states. And California, for example, sort of initially led the way, and they've been one that is more expected. I think the reason why the Republican examples get brought up, especially, is that it's much more unexpected in the sort of food policy landscape.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what was it? I mean, I teach this in my ag policy class. Several years ago, the Texas Ag Commissioner was saying schools can have deep fryers if they want to. You can bring cupcakes to the classroom. So this isn't quite that, but it does seem like something of a shift.
It's been super interesting to see the political realignment here. I know Trey Malone and co-authors, I'll have to go back and find the full list. They have a paper where they look at over time increasing Republican interest in government oversight in food. So it's not completely new, but MAHA has truly invigorated this interest and given people license to move forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, I need to get Trey on at some point.
Yeah, he would be fun.
He would be fun. I want to get into some of the other areas that you've studied as a part of the Gardner program. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about on the MAHA side?
On MAHA, I feel like we covered most of the MAHA things. Check back in a few weeks.
Yeah, we might have to make this regular.
Yes, we're going to have regular, yeah.
I mean, so I guess something that's closer to my work, which is public support for farmers. You've done work on that, I know. Politicians, legislators always are, talking about farmers as the backbone of America. I think that drives a lot of support for the farm safety net and other policies. But what are you finding about public perception?
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot over the last 3 years on perceptions of agricultural payments, especially, and when farmers should get financial support. We have done some on differences across commodities. So which type of commodities does the public think that we should be most strongly supporting? We've done a little bit on farm size. And then we've also just done a lot on the reason why a farmer would be receiving financial support. So things like, weather affecting crops, really broadly supported, right? Natural disaster sort of payments, very, very, very widely supported, bipartisan support. There are other things like environmental compliance and, improving sustainability. That's more supported by Democrats and Republicans. There's one of the things that we got to track was support for farmers during tariff issues or during trade issues. And we found that although that's not a well-supported type of payment for farmers, support for that type of payment went up pretty significantly during the election and following the election when we were talking more about tariffs and the implications for farmers. Yeah, so that's sort of the background on the types of the payments that consumers are more supportive of. It's been interesting to see, there's also a group of consumers, especially more liberal consumers, that would prefer to see sort of minimum income payments for farmers.
Yeah.
And, the literature and stuff would talk. Let me start over. The literature would suggest that some of this is coming from our perceptions of what farmers are, what farmers are to us. We imagine that farmers are poorer than they are. We imagine that farms are smaller than they are, right? There's these perceptions of what a farm is and how consumers interpret that. But there's also a piece of it that comes from consumers really want a strong national supply of food, and there's like a food security safety aspect where they want food to be protected in that way.
Okay, so overall strong support.
Very strong support.
For programs that help farmers. It varies a little bit by the type of program.
Correct.
And it seems to be driven by a general positive perception of farmers, as well as people see food as a national security issue or just something that's very important to them.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, that'll be fun to watch as you keep tracking this over time. It's going to be a great data set.
It is. It's going to be super interesting.
Very cool. So support for food price controls, and this was, both parties at the last election, something you've worked on. And before we get into the details, I don't think we put a cap on the price of flour or the price of steak anymore. That I think Nixon administration was the last time. So how should I think about food price controls in a modern sense?
Sure, yeah. So where we came into this was we were watching, election campaigns like everyone else. And we were hearing candidates on both sides of the aisle making promises that food prices were going to come down and that if elected, they would be capable of reducing food prices. Persistent food and price inflation was a particular pain point and has been for a while. And so, politicians were promising to lower food prices. A lot of the specifics of the ways that they were going to address it was unclear, but some of the things that we heard were things like, we're going to crack down on price gouging. We're going to crack down on shrinkflation, so selling the same product for the same price, but a smaller volume. We also heard things like, we're going to break up the meat packing. We're going to improve competition. We did occasionally hear things like, we're going to invest in precision agriculture or agricultural techniques that are going to improve productivity. But most of the time it was a lot of hand waving and saying, we're going to bring prices down. And so we had been tracking people's frustrations with food prices for a while and been showing that an increasing proportion of people thought that the US food system was unaffordable and that people were increasingly frustrated with food price inflation. And then after all of these promises were made, we wanted to sort of understand, were these promises landing? And so we basically found that about 75% of Republican participants said that they thought only Republicans could reduce prices in stores, grocery prices. We found about 61% of Democrats said that only Democrats could reduce food prices. And independents and others were more split, but about 30% of independents and others thought that neither party could bring down food prices. So there was not a lot of skepticism from either Republicans or Democratic participants. We saw about 5% of Republicans said that politicians couldn't bring food prices down, and about 8% of Democrats said that politicians couldn't bring food prices down. Independents and others were more skeptical, but in general, none of the three groups was incredibly skeptical. These promises were landing. And then following the election, we asked about the decisions that people made. So we had a wave in November right after the election, and we asked about what issues were important to their voting. And we found that for about 60% of the people who said they voted for Trump, cost of living or the economy were the most important issue for them in the election. It was a lot lower for the people who voted for Harris at the time. And then also, perhaps even more interestingly, about 44% of participants who said they sat this election out said that cost of living and inflation was the most important issue to them. It does seem like food prices and the cost of living more generally was central to the outcomes of this election.
Right. It's something that people experience every day.
Yeah. And, following the election, Donald Trump did say that he felt like he owed the win to both border security and high food prices. So I think people realized the centrality of food and food policy in this election.
Right. Absolutely. And I guess let's put on our economist hats for a little bit. All these policies seem very indirect to affect food prices. I imagine it's quite hard to actually use policy to decrease the price of food, especially if we're not in a world where we can just say, you're going to lower that price and make it happen.
Yeah, correct. So in interviews before the election, I tried to convey that economists would not agree with the promises that were being made that if elected, presidential candidates could lower food prices, and that economists would instead say something like, the rate of inflation has gone down, things have slowed, we're happy with, where things are moving, and that sort of the odd thing about inflation for consumers is that they don't think about things in rates, they think about it in levels. So they're going to say, oh, well, I remember a few years ago, I could buy all of my groceries for $100 and now it's $200 and that's infuriating. How we sort of get past that is people start to get used to higher prices, things take on different values, and you no longer bulk at a $200 weekly grocery bill the same way that you did in, a few years ago. So
yeah.
We have seen that happen where people have gotten less frustrated with food prices. And a part of this is like an economist would ask, like, is your wage keeping pace with the costs of living? So it's not really about like your grocery bill being so much higher, but is it that the amount of time that you're having to work for that, basket of food, is that keeping pace? And so we've also seen some conversation around that, but frustration has gone down slightly. People are less concerned about affordability than they were, a few months ago during the campaign cycle. How much of this is like people have gotten used to it versus like we're not talking about it as much, and so it's like less front of mind? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's an issue it's going to keep coming back. Do you think it's fair to say it's going to be difficult to actually address this through policy? I mean, there's things that can be done, but it's going to be hard.
If I was in this survey, I would have been one of the skeptics, one of the few.
Maybe that's why we're called the dismal science.
Yes, exactly. Yes, we're a lot of fun at parties.
That's all right. You had anything else about food prices?
Well, I'll just say if people are interested in the Gardner Food and Ag Policy work on food prices, you can go to Farm Doc Daily. All of our work is there. We dive into lots of things in detail. We look at, how do people want food manufacturers to respond? Do they want them to shrink food products? Do they want to raise prices? Do they want them to be, upfront about things? We look at restaurants versus grocery store. There's lots and lots of detail. If you are a food policy wonk like me, head to Farm Doc.
Absolutely. And I know you talked about you've also done work on food safety and farm size. So definitely stuff people will be interested in.
There's no shortage.
Yep. There's one thing I'm starting to ask people, and I should have warned you in advance. I've been asking people if you get to change one policy, what would it be? That's a fun one. And then you don't have to answer it if you're not, or you can take some time to think. And the other thing is, what would you like somebody to know about your work that you think maybe they don't know?
Okay. If I change one policy.
Yeah. I need to give warning. I've been kind of.
Yeah, I might have to circle back to you on that one. That's an interesting, tricky question. What do I want people to know about my work? We talked about how the goal of your podcast is to unpack sort of the difficulties of food and ag policy and to try to understand like what's behind the curtain. I think our work is trying to do something sort of similar where we're trying to align public perceptions with what's going on with food and ag policy. So we're trying to understand where is the disconnect, what promises are being made, how does the public feel about it, and does that align with actual spending or actual policies? Because ultimately, as both taxpayers and consumers, there's a responsibility to the public in this way. So even though ag and food policy exist, generally pretty far away from the public, their perspectives on this are important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about my answers, it's not... Maybe burn down the farm safety net, let people rebuild it to something that's more modern and less complicated is one. Or let agriculture make its own labor policy outside of the national dialogue. That would be another. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Smoke and Mirrors. If today made you think or see things a little differently, share it with someone who appreciates cutting through the noise. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for spending part of the day with us. Until next time, keep asking what matters.